Hello, this is Christian Perring, and I'm going to be talking today about the article by Luke Brunning on the distinctiveness of polyamory. In this article, Brunning is basically spelling out what he thinks polyamory is. And he's also trying to explain why people would think polyamory is a viable option and a morally defensible option. So it's a fairly straightforward article, and it raises a lot of issues. Brunning is partly reacting against traditional theories of love, which make it sort of essential to the nature of love that it be a relationship between two people exclusively and without other romantic connections. He refers to, in ancient philosophy, one of the parts of the dialogue in Plato's Symposium, which is a kind of a dialogue between several ancient philosophers, in which one of the philosophers advocates love as being explained by an old myth where people were originally kind of different sorts of creatures with two faces and four arms and four legs and different sets of genitals, and they were split up by the gods, and after that they were forever trying to find their other half, the half they had been split up from. So obviously that's just a myth, but it gives an idea of this idea that essentially love is about trying to find your other half, and definitely that means you would not be able to have a multi-person relationship. Uh, and that's not necessarily, a view which all the ancient philosophers agreed to, but it was a powerful myth. Then there's the views of Robert Nozick, the Harvard philosopher, and he argued in his writing on love that love is essentially a matter of two people merging. No, this merging idea, two people becoming one, forming a greater identity, uh, it's not necessarily impossible to imagine kind of three people merging. But then there's a question about, well, how do they all relate to each other? And I guess in polyamory, the idea is not necessarily that everybody is in love with everybody else, but rather you have one-on-one connections of love, but one person can love several people at the same time. So certainly the merging concept doesn't really make a whole lot of sense with polyamory. Brunning goes on to kind of give a sort of explanation of what he is thinking about in terms of polyamory. So certainly it's about multiple loves. That's no surprise. A system where one person has multiple loving romantic relationships, and everybody can have multiple loving relationships. Certainly, it has to be consensual, so there's no deception. So everybody, there's basically complete informed consent. Uh, but then he wants to go a bit further than that. It's not just consensual. He approvingly cites the definition by Alexis Shotwell, where it says it's consensual and also with mutual interest, negotiating desire for more than one relationship, it's not necessarily a very self-explanatory phrase, uh, but the idea is that there's a constant negotiation going on in polyamory. He also wants to say that it's about emotional intimacy more than about sex. It's not just about a bunch of people having a lot of sex, it's about emotional relationships. So it's possible in their polyamorous relationships that even though they're romantic, they are not physically sexual. And so Brunning wants to emphasize the idea that what's really going on in a polyamorous relationship is that people are being very open about their feelings, very kind of expressing their feelings and negotiating their relationships. And all of this is going to be an essential part of his view of polyamory. He says, in some polyamorous relationships, there is hierarchy. Sometimes people have their kind of core family, and they have kids within that core, and then they have other kind of lesser, more contingent relationships outside of that core. But that's not the only way to do polyamory. Other people are kind of work hard to be non-hierarchical, so no particular relationship is prioritized. So there's a kind of diversity of different kinds of polyamorous relationships. Brunning spells out what he considers are some of the appeals of polyamorous relationships. And obviously, they don't require exclusive commitment. So some people don't want exclusive commitment. And one of the reasons may be that they are worried about getting lost in one relationship. The idea is that if you are with one person, and Nozick talked about the idea of emerging identity, well, that seems to be, is that really so great? If your identity merges into that of another person, seems like, well, then you sort of lose your own distinctive identity. And if you're losing it, then that may be a loss. So his idea is that polyamory can help protect you from that kind of loss. If you have lots of loving relationships, then that seems like you've got more love in your life, and that sounds like it's a good thing. There's also the risk of boredom. Long married couples often joke about the idea that it's easy to get bored in a long relationship. Just being with the same person all the time, you get over familiar with them. And if you're in a polyamorous set of relationships, then your levels of boredom are less. And also, if your partner is seeing other people, then they may be kind of growing in other ways in their relationships with other people, so that may make them more interesting to you. Then there's that kind of the idea that in challenging yourself, in focusing on things like jealousy, if you you experience jealousy and you're trying to overcome it, then there's a kind of personal growth involved in that. So that might be a good thing. And then there's a kind of more social vision that if you're aiming towards a world in which polyamory is a kind of standard option, that would create kind of a different sort of social world, and there may be attractions to that kind of world where there is a kind of just a more general appreciation of kind of the idea that it's possible to love many people. So Brunning kind of spells out that those ideas of the comparisons of polyamory with what I'll be calling monoamory, or sometimes just I'll keep it to mono versus poly. And he goes into a little deeper into the kind of critique of polyamory from the perspective of monoamory. He mentions the views of the philosopher Robert Solomon, who argued against polyamory on the basis that polyamory has to be kind of an unstable sort of relationship because there's so much room for conflict. And he says that the defenders of polyamory deny this. They say that having polyamorous relationships can be just as rich as it is as mono relationships. The source of this richness, Brunning kind of suggests, is that if you are involved with multiple people, then you develop multiple sides of yourself rather than just having a relationship with one person which develops one side of you. If you're in multiple relationships, then you develop various sides of you responding to different kinds of people, different people bring out different things in you. And also it means that you're getting your views of yourself reflected back, and you're getting more reality checks in those different relationships. So you're actually, in some ways, more grounded in life because you're having these multiple relationships. So in the poly view, uh, the poly view wants to say that in some ways, poly relationships are quite like friendships. And we're certainly very comfortable with saying that people can have multiple friends. It was an issue, actually, among some theorists of friendships about to what extent you can have lots of deep friends. I think Aristotle suggests you can really only have maybe 2 or 3 deep friendships. And Michel de Montaigne, a French writer, actually kind of thinks that you can only really have one true friendship. So there are ideas that maybe the number of true friends you could have, like maybe what we might call a best friend, is limited. But on the whole, we tend to think that we can have lots of close friendships. And so the poly view wants to say that, well, that's true with romantic relationships too. You can have lots of strong romantic relationships. While the mono view, the monoamorous view, wants to have a strong distinction between friendship and romance, and wants to say romance is just between 2 people and it has to be exclusive. Friendship doesn't have to be exclusive. The poly view is kind of saying, well, you have friendships which are non-sexual, and you have friendships which have romance and love in them too, and sometimes sex. So I guess the idea of the poly view is kind of more fluid about these things. When people are defending poly relationships, polyamorous relationships, often the way they do that is by trying to make polyamorous relationships look very much like regular monoamorous relationships, because then it seems a little less shocking. And certainly that sort of approach seems to work quite well in those advocating for gay rights. They want to say, well, gay relationships are just like straight relationships, except that they're between 2 people of the same sex or the same gender. And so that there's a kind of pragmatic advantage to arguing that poly relationships are just like mono relationships, except there's more of them, there's more people involved. So it's very understandable why people would want to say that. But one of the things that Brunning wants to do is suggest that, in fact, poly relationships are sort of different in many ways from monoamorous relationships. So he's going to do that by kind of setting out his views of polyamory. And before he does that, he elaborates four objections to polyamory, which he will then reply to after he has kind of spelled out his view of polyamory. So here are the four objections he lists. The first is that polyamory leads inexorably to the objectification or commodification of other people. That it is polyamorous love is kind of immature, and it's not true attachment. That polyamory stretches people too thinly. You need monogamy in order to have enough resources for the other person, and that polyamory is risky and precarious, and there's going to be lots of little short-term relationships. So he thinks that once you understand polyamory, you will realize that it can give replies to all these objections. In monogamous relationships, monoamorous relationships, there's this assumption about kind of sexual attraction that two people in a loving monogamous relationship are never going to even notice anybody else sexually. They're not going to be attracted to anybody, and they're not even going to think of anybody else in romantic ways. So there's partly the idea, well, that's the nature of true love, but also there are kind of various mechanisms by which society tries to enforce that ideal and says it's inappropriate for people in a monogamous relationship to kind of spend too much time with people of, well, if they're heterosexual, of the opposite sex. If they're gay, maybe they shouldn't be spending too much time with people of the same sex. But generally, this idea comes into the model is in heterosexual monogamous relationships. There was a whole thing about the politician Mike Pence that he would refuse to be alone in a room with a woman because he thought it was totally inappropriate. Now, that seems a sort of extreme view, but it kind of does sort of symbolize the sort of views about monogamous heterosexual relationships that it's inappropriate to even have any temptation to kind of want another person. So you just make sure that you're never alone too much with people who you could possibly be attracted to apart from your significant other. So polyamory, Brunning explains, just rejects that whole way of thinking and says, if you're in one relationship, you're still open to other relationships, and you're just honest about your feelings. You are saying you could be attracted to somebody else, and you're ready to explore. So there's a much greater idea of fluidity in the idea of polyamory. So as you see, the whole idea of polyamory wants to reject many of the norms about relationships that go along with the monogamous views. And rejecting those norms is not just rejecting the kind of rules that are set out in society, but also it means rejecting the internalized norms that you've grown up with. So it means a lot of self-questioning. Brunning also says that you have to kind of confront power imbalances in relationships, especially regarding gender roles. It's a big thing uh, in a lot of relationships these days. To what extent do you embrace gender roles, the traditional man, the traditional woman, and to what extent you could have say, well, that's old school, and we need to kind of go beyond that. He also mentions there can be even power relationships in race, going on with race, and you have to question that. So he wants to say that a poly life is not just a kind of like monogamy, but more. He wants to say, in fact, it's a pretty radical stance because you're definitely questioning a lot of the social ideas that go along with love and romance. One of the ideas that Brunning really sets out is that in a polyamorous life, you're doing a lot of emotional work, uh, and it's certainly true in any relationship, and certainly any loving relationship. There's emotional work where you're thinking about where you are in the relationship, and if there's problems, you're talking it through. Uh, and But what Brunning wants to say is, you can have all these kind of intellectual ideas about being open to a poly life, but when you're actually living it, you really have to kind of think quite hard about how to carry that out in real life. And so Brunning says that's the emotional work. It's not just thinking about it; it's actually doing it and being in relationships where you're constantly kind of negotiating ideas and talking about power imbalances and sorting things out. Uh, and that's maybe made especially difficult in a society where poly life is unusual, because there's less general space for doing those things. There's less social support, and there's less collective wisdom about how to deal with those things. So he wants to say that a polyamorous life, has a lot more complexity and unpredictability than a monogamous life. So Brunning emphasizes that when you're doing all this emotional work, it's a real challenge. Yeah, it's not easy going. You're constantly having to kind of think about relationships and how things are going. Now, he mentions, like, if you're in a relationship and your partner says, "Oh, we need to talk," then that sounds like, oh, there's a big problem in the relationship. However, Brunning says, the idea that we need to talk should be a sort of standard thing, a frequent part of a relationship where you're constantly examining how the relationship is and working out how it is in relationship to your other kind of connections with people. Uh, and there has to be you have to do it in a way which is non-confrontational. You're not being judgy. You're just talking about your feelings. You're exploring your feelings. You're not even necessarily endorsing your feelings. For example, if you're jealous, the jealousy is something to be acknowledged but not necessarily endorsed. Uh, when you're in negotiation about a relationship, you have to be able to hear about other people's emotions, about their attractions to other people, and hear that in a non-judgmental way. So he thinks it's a really kind of powerful experience to be involved in that kind of work, but it's hard work. So it is definitely a whole different mode of being, according to Brunning. All right, so now we've kind of spelled out his view of what polyamory is. This leads us to then be able to reply to the objections that he had previously discussed. So the first one is saying that polyamory is like you kind of you just looking for certain qualities in certain people, and you're just trying to kind of get more experience, and so you're just treating other people as commodities. Uh, you're just objectifying people and kind of not really seeing them as full people. And Brunning wants to say, well, that's just totally not what's happening in polyamorous relationships. It's all about kind of exactly seeing other people as full people and examining your relationship with them. And so he doesn't think there's anything kind of greedy about wanting to have more loving relationships. In fact, in some ways, it's a very brave thing to do in his view. It's not kind of taking the easy way out. It's kind of actually really challenging yourself. He also points out that monogamous relationships also, can involve objectification and commodification too. So the idea that polyamory is especially vulnerable to this problem is something he thinks is wrong. I think he just thinks it's a feature. It's a danger in all relationships, and you just have to be kind of ready to deal with that in all relationships. Now he moves on to the second objection to polyamory, that if you're trying to have lots of different relationships, that's basically immature, and it means you can't really have a really deep relationship with one person. And his reply is that polyamory is all about doing all this emotional work, having deep relationships. So in fact, it really fosters that depth in ways that maybe a monogamous relationship is not so inclined to do. He points out that in some polyamorous relationships, people to have their core relationship, like their family, and that it can be a relationship which provides security and permanence. And in those sort of core relationships, the poly person has other relationships which are kind of maybe less central, and so the poly relationship kind of that sort of poly relationship seems to particularly kind of mirror the idea of a monogamous relationship and that kind of long-term serious intimacy. So he thinks that this objection just doesn't work at all. Moving on then to the third relationship, sorry, the third objection. The objection is that if you're having a whole bunch of relationships, then you're spreading people too thinly. Now, I guess part of that idea is also there in the second objection, and he sort of tried to reply to that. But in particular, we might think about resources. How can you have enough money to be in lots of different serious relationships if you're trying to kind of build a life with people? And Brunning replies is like, well, if everybody has their own income, then the money isn't going to be an issue. The objection seems to be about the case where you're imagining one person, maybe a husband, supporting several wives. Then there is a question, and we've seen that in the history of polygamy. Sometimes there are questions about can the husband provide for all his wives? But in the kind of cases that Brunning is thinking about, and he's not thinking about that kind of restriction. He thinks you can have, if everybody has their own job, then there's going to be enough resources. There's not going to be a worry about it. Can one person provide for others? And then if you're thinking about childcare, then if you have lots of people around, then everybody can kind of chip in, so there are going to be more resources available in poly relationships. And that can also be true in cases where you have poly relationships without children. People can help each other out. So he thinks that, in fact, if anything, there's going to be more resources available in poly relationships. Finally, we get to the fourth objection, that people who engage in poly relationships are leading risky, precarious lifestyles. So the idea is, in traditional marriage, people are there in it for the long haul. They stay together. Whereas in poly relationships, it's not so serious, and they're not really kind of really in it for the long haul. So it's just not as serious relationships. And his reply, Brunning's reply, is, well, that's wrong, because poly relationships can be stable. Maybe they aren't always stable, but they can be very rewarding. He thinks in some ways poly relationships, because you have all the interconnection of people, there's more resistance to external shocks than there would be in monogamous relationships. If one person gets ill, or there's a breakup, then people actually have more resources to fall back on because they have other relationships in their life. Whereas if one person is ill in a marriage, then the remaining person is under a great deal of pressure if there aren't any resources to fall back on. So he wants to say, that there isn't necessarily risk. He thinks diversification provides stability. He doesn't necessarily kind of go into this, but the other thing we might want to add is, in the modern world, monogamy is no guarantee that you're going to have security, or that it's going to last forever. We're very familiar with the idea that a lot of marriages end in divorce. So the idea that monogamy provides lots of security seems a bit misguided. So, having replied to those four objections, Brunning wants to say, he thinks polyamory is certainly a totally viable option, uh, but he wants to guard against the idea that polyamory is necessarily like the perfect sort of situation, and he worries that it can be idealized by people defending polyamory. So he wants to say that there is this kind of model that in polyamorous relationships everybody is really close to each other and there's lots of full communication. He says, well, that's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes if one person's in a relationship with somebody else, they don't want to know about the person's other partners. They want just distance. And he wants to say, there can be problems in polyamorous relationships, just as there can be problems in all relationships. So we shouldn't kind of assume that polyamorous relationships are going to be perfect. And in particular, he thinks there can be kind of an overemphasis on the idea that everyone needs to talk to each other. He says, well, it's certainly communication is an ideal, but there can be limits to that too. So he's against totally idealizing polyamory. So in conclusion, uh, he wants to kind of say that what he's tried to do is spell out both what polyamory is and what its strengths are, and how it can, how the defenders of polyamory can reply to those people who say that it's not serious. And so he thinks what he's done is just going to give a good, rich depiction of what polyamory is, and so that shows how it can be a desirable way to live. All right, that's it. End of the presentation.